Hi, everyone, and welcome to week 3 of Strategic Planning and Leadership. This week we start to explore the contrast between good strategy and bad strategy. We get into the Rummelt book a little bit, and so before we talk about that, I just wanted to go through what's on the agenda for the week. We do get into our first discussion forum this week in Moodle, and so those discussion topics will be over readings and material from week 2 and from this week. The primary reading for this week is from the Good Strategy, Bad Strategy book, chapters 1 through 3. And then I also included I think it's about an 18-minute video of Richard Rummelt talking about good strategy in volatile times. What I thought I would do for this lecture, try to keep it fairly short, but I thought I would just pull out some of the sort of highlights of these first 3 chapters, specifically addressed a few of the things that Rummelt points out are indicators of good strategy, and then some of the symptoms of bad strategy. And then we'll have much more opportunity in the discussion forums to go into depth in some of those. So just a few things about good strategy that he talks about. One of those, a key thing about good strategy is that it entails focused action. And he talks about how most organizations they don't do this. They really, instead of focusing their attention on the most important things, they tend to spread out their resources rather than concentrating them. And I think from a leadership aspect, one of the reasons this happens is that there is typically, as you get bigger and more complex organizations, there tends to be more both internal and external pressures to meet a lot of interests, meet a lot of demands. And so I certainly see this at the university, that it is really hard to focus and to basically talk about what you're not going to do as much as what you are going to do. So that is one of the hallmarks of this is as a leader, you have to make some really difficult decisions. You have to have some courage to say, not everything is the most important thing at this point. Another thing that Rummelt talks about, and I think this is a really sort of the fascinating thing about strategy that we'll get into as the semester goes along, is good strategy involves game-changing insights and perspectives. So in the book, one of the examples he uses is Walmart and sort of their ability to take the conventional wisdom about putting stores in towns and how big the population had to be to support that. And really their game-changing insight was about the fact that no longer should we think about stores, but we should be thinking in terms of the network and the entire process that supports the stores in those towns. One of the books that we'll talk a little bit more about as we go on through the semester, and I'll pull a little bit of material from, is this book called A Beautiful Constraint. One of the things I wanted to sort of pull out from this is that what I see in a lot of organizations, and I've seen this in previous classes that I've taught, is that there's sort of this prevailing belief that a lot of strategy can't be done because there simply aren't the resources to do that. I had a boss years back who basically refused to engage in strategic planning. And his rationale was that strategic planning, all it does is that it creates sort of a wish list of additional things that you want to do that all require additional funding or additional resources. And he would say, I know those additional resources aren't available, so why would I waste my time in strategic planning? And so that sort of goes back to the previous slide, that he didn't really understand that the real value of strategic planning was to focus those resources. What I wanted to mention about A Beautiful Constraint is that really a lot of the best, most innovative insights come from the fact that you are addressing that there are constraints within your situation, whether those are money constraints, personnel constraints, whatever that might be. So one of the things that this book talks about is, how do you get the process of gaining these insights? And it talks about the key is asking these propelling questions, or these sort of paradoxical questions of, how can we both consider, really ambitious, bold, ambitious ideas, but at the same time consider the significant constraints and link those two things together. And so, I think they did that a little bit in the Walmart example of, the bold ambition was to obviously sort of dominate the market. The constraint was, how do we do that in these smaller towns where typically nobody's been able to put a large store like this in it. Some other examples. There's in this beautiful constraint book they talk about a car company who in the racing in the racing area wanted to win more races. That was their goal. But the constraint was that they couldn't make their cars any faster. And so how do you do that? Well, obviously, when you have that constraint of not being able to make a faster car, you start looking at other things. And so they started looking at, well, we could win more races if we had fewer pit stops. And so the innovation came in the area of fuel efficiency. There's other stories about agriculture in developing nations. How can we grow more crops by using less water? And so we'll talk a little bit more about that as we get into sort of the design process and the creative thinking processes. As how can you either acknowledge that you do have these real constraints in your environment, or in some cases it's advantageous to actually create some artificial constraints that help your creative process and help you gain some insights that are novel and move you in a different direction. Another one of the things that Rummelt talks about, and I almost left this out, but he talks about you should always consider the competition. And obviously a lot of the examples that Rummelt uses in his book are from the business, private sector. And so I almost left it out for that reason, but then I got to thinking there is a lot of competition even in the public and nonprofit areas as well. Certainly I work at the university, and competition is incredibly important part of our strategy. We're competing with other traditional universities for students. We're competing with sort of new, emerging external competitors in terms of delivery of education and lifelong learning and those sorts of things. And so as you're working on your projects this semester, I encourage you to keep this in mind. Think about the competition. Don't just look internally to the organization, but what does it mean in terms of being able to compete for funding, to be able to compete for potentially customers that could be an important part of the organization. So this quote, whenever an organization succeeds greatly, there is also at the same time either blocked or failed competition. The third sign of good strategy that he talks about is coherence of design. I happen to have an electronic version of the textbook, and so I did just a search for the word coherence and found that it shows up 51 times in the book. And then I did a search on the word design, and it shows up 179 times in the Rummelt book. So obviously this is a really important concept to think about. Again, it is something similar to the focused action that a lot of organizations don't do. And signs of this, of organizations that don't have a coherence in design, is that they have multiple objectives that aren't necessarily connected to each other. They may have a lot of goals that either don't tie together or in some cases conflict with each other. There's competing interests that are all trying to be served at the same time. And so, it says, good strategy doesn't just draw on existing strengths, but it creates strength through this coherence of its design. So we'll get into this much more in the conversation this week, and then this will be a big focal point of the class going forward. And then we talk about in the bad strategy. There's a chapter where Rummelt really pretty clearly lays out 4 different signs of bad strategy in organizations. So one of those he talks about is fluff, and so it's pretty easy to spot fluff in a strategic plan when you're reading one online. So typically fluff is about language. It's about vague generalities, really abstract language, buzzwords. One of the terms that Rummelt uses is Sunday words. I did a Google search just to look around for examples. This one is sort of a random one that I pulled from a different university's strategic plan. So goal 1, to forge a new inclusive identity that reflects a more representative profile of students and staff and the cultures, values, heritage, and epistemologies of the diversity of the university's staff and students. So this is the kind of language that you see a lot in strategic plans. And I think this emerges for a number of reasons. One of those reasons is that, I think there's just not a deep enough understanding of what the real problems are. And so, Einstein has that great quote that, if you can't explain something simply, you don't understand it well enough. So I think there's a little bit of that happens in organizations, is that this kind of language just sort of masks the fact that people really don't know deeply and with clarity what the real issues are that they're trying to address. I think there's a little bit of simply ego involved, trying to sound like you are intelligent and you know what you're talking about. I think there's a little bit of avoidance of accountability, by making these really vague, abstract goals and objectives. It's a little bit harder to nail somebody down to being accountable for whether or not you succeeded in meeting those goals. I want to share one other example of this sort of language that I've used back in previous workshops that I've done around communication. So this is an example of, I think it's a made-up example, but this would be sort of an example mission statement from NASA. Our mission is to become the international leader in the space industry through maximum team-centered innovation and strategically targeted aerospace initiatives. So lots of buzzwords in there. One of the things that Rummelt talks about is one of the real jobs of a leader is to sort of absorb the complexity of what the organization does and to be able to tell a simpler story. And so I've used this example in the past in communications workshops and contrasted this really vague, abstract language with President Kennedy's moonshot speech, where his language was incredibly concrete and he told a very simple story. As you probably remember reading, it's something to the effect that our goal should be by the end of this decade to land a man on the moon and safely return him to the earth. So very concrete. It's something that you can envision, and you can sort of see the power of that in terms of the animating action, motivating resources and focusing resources on that goal. So important to sort of avoid this fluff, and that's something we'll work on during the semester. Failure to face the problem. I think this is a little bit similar to what I was just talking about, is that if you really don't know the depth of the problem that you're dealing with, you tend to try to gloss over it with your language. So I think this requires some really deep reflection, some really deep homework. It requires some real courage from leaders to really be honest and forthcoming about what the organization's problems and challenges are going forward. I'll let you read this quote. As he says, if you don't identify and analyze the obstacles, you really have either stretch goals, a budget, or a wish list, basically. And that sort of leads into the third of his bad strategies, mistaking goals for strategies. As he says, goals themselves aren't enough. The goals need to be supported by strategy, and the strategy is really the how. How, if you see a strategic plan and you don't really see how the organization plans to accomplish their goals, they've probably committed this mistake of not really taking it to the next level of in Rummelt's process, having that guiding policy and those coherent actions of how you're going to move forward. And then finally, the fourth bad strategy that he talks about is having bad strategic objectives. And he mentions a couple of different types of these. One of those he calls the dog's dinner objective. So that is the long list of, the long to-do list, basically. Lots and lots of different tactical things that are going to be accomplished, but no real coherence as to what the larger purpose of that is. And then the other bad objective that he talks about is what he calls blue sky objectives. And so he talks about, if a goal or objective isn't realistic or it isn't achievable, then that's sort of that bad strategic objective. I think there's a fine line here, and we'll talk a lot about this as we go forward. I think there's one week where we sort of delve into goal setting and thinking about what I call, what's called 10x thinking about how you make something 10 times better instead of 10% better. And so where is that line drawn? How do you know if your objectives are achievable or not? I thought I would quickly, as the last thing I'll share here, is an example of this from my work on the University Strategic Planning Committee a few years ago. One of the things that we talked about as we were going through the process, we had a faculty member on the committee who really felt that our goal should be to raise our admission standards, to raise the quality of students that we accepted into the university. His background, he came from the Ivy League culture. He really sort of, his goal was that he wanted to make Montana sort of the Ivy League of the region. And there were, if you think about that, there are a number of sort of constraining things about that. One is it doesn't really meet the university's mission and sort of the expectations of a publicly funded university. It also, there's all kinds of potential reasons why that would not be achievable. But as we worked through the process, one of the potential objectives that did sort of emerge was, the university could be one of the nation's leaders in what's called social mobility. It's that idea of taking a student maybe from an economically disadvantaged background and through their education, raising their standard of living, raising their families' economic situations considerably. And so that became a really, and I think there is actually an index. There is a way to measure that right now. I took a look before I recorded this. The University of Montana right now is ranked 197th in the nation in social mobility. So clearly there are some opportunities to move up in that. So that's sort of what I was, I guess I'm getting at is that is a really ambitious objective. We had talked about, how could we get into the top 25 in the nation in social mobility? It's both achievable. It is something that is compatible with the overall mission and sort of purpose of the University of Montana. And so we'll talk more about that. That is it for the lecture this week, but I really am interested in now engaging with you a little bit during the week in the online discussion forums and hearing what you have to say, what some of your thoughts are on good strategy and bad strategy. So have a good week, everyone. Thank you.